The wedding dress was a cage, and Mara Holloway was about to burn it down. Standing at the altar in a Kansas church packed with silent witnesses, she learned the truth. Her groom didn't want a wife. He wanted her father's land, her water rights, her future carved up and sold. The congregation watched, waiting for her to crumble. Instead, she tore off her veil, spit defiance at the man who tried to buy her, and walked straight into the wilderness with nothing but rage and a torn dress. This is the story of the bride who refused to bow. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay until the end, because what happens next will leave you breathless. The heat inside the First Methodist Church of Grafton, Kansas, was thick enough to chew. July sun hammered through the tall windows, turning the pine pews into ovens and the stale air into soup. Mara Holloway stood at the front of that airless room in a dress 3 sizes too small, sweat pooling beneath the whalebone corset her mother had laced so tight she could barely breathe. The lace scratched her neck. The bodice pinched her ribs. Every inch of white fabric felt like a punishment. She wasn't supposed to look like this. The dress had belonged to her cousin Ruth, narrow-hipped, bird-boned Ruth, who'd married a banker's son 2 years prior and moved to Topeka. Mara's mother had insisted it could be altered. It couldn't. The seams screamed when she moved. The buttons gaped. The veil, yellowed with age, smelled faintly of camphor and desperation. Behind her, the church was full. Rows of faces she'd known her entire life stared at the back of her head. Farmers, shopkeepers, the postmaster's wife, the blacksmith's daughter. Women who'd whispered about her since she was 12, when her body started filling out in ways that made men look twice and women look away. Men who'd never asked her to dance but had plenty to say about her behind her back. She could feel their eyes crawling over her shoulders, weighing her like livestock at auction. The organ wheezed out something that might have been a hymn. Reverend Calhoun stood in front of her with his Bible open, his jowls glistening with sweat. To her left stood the groom, Thaddeus Kern, thin as a fence post, with slicked back hair the color of dishwater, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He wore a suit that looked expensive, too expensive for a man who claimed to work as a clerk at the land office. His hands were soft, no calluses, no dirt under the nails. He didn't look at Mara when she'd walked down the aisle. He looked past her, toward the back of the church, like he was waiting for someone. Mara had met him exactly 4 times before today. The first time was at the general store, where he'd tipped his hat and complimented her hair. The second was at her father's farm, where he'd arrived unannounced with a bouquet of wildflowers and a contract folded in his coat pocket. The third was at Sunday service, where he'd sat 2 rows behind her and stared at the back of her neck the entire sermon. The fourth was 3 days ago, when he'd shown up at the farm again, this time with her father, and the 2 of them had shaken hands over something Mara wasn't allowed to hear. Her father had looked relieved. That was the part that scared her most. Reverend Calhoun cleared his throat. "Dearly beloved," the church doors slammed open. Every head turned. A man strode in like he owned the building. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit with a silver watch chain glinting against his vest. His boots struck the floorboards with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in his life. His face was all sharp angles. Strong jaw, high cheekbones, eyes the color of winter sky. Handsome in the way a knife was handsome. Cold, precise, dangerous. Gideon Vale. Mara had never met him, but she knew the name. Everyone in 3 counties knew the name. Cattle broker, land speculator. The man who'd bought up half the water rights between Grafton and Dodge City and now controlled who drank and who didn't. Her father had mentioned him once, late at night, drunk and bitter, cursing the day Vale's outfit had moved into the territory. Vale walked up the center aisle without hurrying. The congregation parted like he was Moses and they were the Red Sea. No one spoke. No one moved. He stopped 10 feet from the altar. "Apologies for the interruption, Reverend," Vale said. His voice was smooth, educated, with just enough Western drawl to remind you he wasn't from back east. "But I'm afraid this wedding can't proceed." Reverend Calhoun's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. "Mr. Vale, this is highly irregular. So is fraud." Vale's gaze slid to Thaddeus, who had gone white as a bedsheet. "Isn't that right, Kern?" Thaddeus didn't answer. He took a step back. Mara's heart slammed against her ribs. "What are you talking about?" Vale turned to her for the first time. His eyes swept over her face, her dress, her clenched fists. For a moment, something flickered in his expression, pity, maybe, or calculation. Then it was gone. "Miss Holloway," he said, and his tone was almost gentle. "Do you know why this man wants to marry you?" Her throat tightened. "Because—" "It's not because he loves you. It's not because you're beautiful, though I'm sure someone's told you that once or twice." His mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "It's because your father owns 160 acres with the only reliable creek for 15 miles. And the moment you say, 'I do,' that land stops being his. It becomes community property, which means Kern here gets half." The church was silent. Mara stared at Thaddeus. "Is that true?" He didn't look at her. "Mara, it's not— Is it true?" "It's more complicated than that." "Answer her," Vale said quietly. Thaddeus's jaw worked. Finally, he lifted his chin. "Your father's in debt. $600 to the Cattlemen's Association. If he doesn't pay by October, they'll foreclose. I was trying to help." "By stealing her inheritance?" Vale cut in. "By offering a solution," Thaddeus snapped. "She was never going to marry anyone else. Look at her. She's 24 years old, built like a—" Vale moved. 1 second he was standing still. The next, he had Thaddeus by the collar, lifting him onto his toes. "Finish that sentence," Vale said softly, "and I'll break your jaw." Mara's pulse roared in her ears. She looked at her father, sitting in the front pew beside her mother. His face was gray. His hands were shaking. "You knew," she said. Her father's eyes dropped to the floor. "You knew," her voice cracked. "You sold me." "Mara, please." Her mother reached for her. Mara jerked away. The veil tore in her hand. She looked at the congregation, at the women who'd mocked her, the men who'd ignored her, the entire town that had watched her walk into this trap and said nothing. Not one of them met her eyes. She turned to Thaddeus, still dangling in Vale's grip. "You want the land so bad?" She ripped the veil off her head and threw it at his feet. "Then dig for it yourself." She shoved past Vale, past the Reverend, past the rows of silent faces. Her dress caught on a pew and tore. She didn't stop. She hit the church doors with both hands and slammed them open, stepping out into the blinding Kansas sun. Behind her, she heard her mother crying, her father calling her name. She didn't look back. "Bossy." The town of Grafton was a single dirt street flanked by wooden buildings that looked like a strong wind could knock them over. General store, saloon, land office, livery stable, bank, everything a frontier town needed to pretend it mattered. Mara walked down the center of that street in her torn wedding dress, and every person she passed turned to stare. Mrs. Gentry, standing outside the dry goods store with a basket of eggs, whispered something to her daughter. 2 men outside the saloon elbowed each other and laughed. A little boy pointed. His mother slapped his hand down. Mara kept walking. She had no plan, no money, no horse. Her father's farm was 3 miles north, but she'd rather die than go back there. The dress dragged in the dust, the torn hem collecting dirt and burrs. Her feet, crammed into borrowed shoes 2 sizes too small, screamed with every step. She made it to the edge of town before her knees gave out. She sank down on the side of the road, in the shade of a cottonwood tree, and stared at the horizon. The prairie stretched out forever, flat, brown, merciless. Heat shimmered off the ground. In the distance, a dust devil spun itself into nothing. She should cry. That's what women did in stories. They cried and someone came to save them. But Mara's eyes were dry. She pulled off the 2 small shoes and hurled them into the scrub. Then she stood, barefoot, and started walking west. By the time the sun started sinking, Mara was miles from Grafton. She had no idea where she was going. West seemed as good a direction as any, away from the town that had watched her humiliation, away from her father's cowardice, away from the life she'd almost been trapped in. Her feet bled. The dress was ruined. Her lips were cracked from thirst. She didn't care. The land changed as she walked, less flat, more rolling. Scrub grass gave way to scattered rock formations. The ground grew uneven, cracked by dry creek beds that hadn't seen water in months. She climbed over a low ridge and found herself staring down into a shallow ravine. At the bottom, something moved. Mara squinted. A horse. No, two horses tied to a scraggly mesquite tree, and beside them, a camp, a bedroll, a saddlebag, a canteen hanging from a branch. She scrambled down the slope, half sliding on loose dirt. Her legs shook, her vision blurred. She reached the camp and grabbed the canteen with trembling hands. The water was warm and tasted like metal, but it was the best thing she'd ever swallowed. Thirsty? Mara spun around. A man stood at the edge of the camp, holding a rifle, not pointing it at her, just holding it, casual, like he'd expected her. He was tall, taller than Vale, broader in the shoulders. His clothes were work-worn, brown trousers, faded shirt, leather vest. His hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that looked like it had been carved out of the same rock as the ravine. Square jaw, crooked nose that had been broken at least once, dark eyes that missed nothing. "I'm sorry," Mara said, her voice hoarse. "I didn't mean—" "Keep drinking." He leaned the rifle against a rock and walked past her to check the horses. "You look half dead." She didn't argue. She drank until her stomach hurt, then lowered the canteen and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. The man glanced at her dress. "Wedding day go bad?" "Something like that." He nodded, like that made perfect sense. "You running from someone or to someone?" "Neither." "Then you're just running." "Maybe." He crouched by the fire pit, stirring the ashes with a stick. "Got a name?" "Mara." "Mara what?" "Does it matter?" He looked up at her. His eyes were dark brown, flecked with gold, tired eyes, old eyes, even though he couldn't have been more than 30. "Not really. You can call me Rowan." "Rowan what?" His mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Mercer. I've got a ranch about 10 miles northwest of here, or what's left of one." Mara sank down onto a rock, her legs finally giving out completely. "What happened to it?" "Drought, debt, bad luck." He poked at the ashes. "Same thing happening to every ranch out here. You lose your water, you lose your cattle. You lose your cattle, you lose everything." She thought of her father's farm, the creek that never ran dry, even in the worst summers. The reason Thaddeus had wanted her in the first place. "I'm sorry," she said. Rowan shrugged. "Not your fault." He stood dusting off his hands. "You planning to stay out here all night?" "I don't know." "Well, you can't. Coyotes will find you before morning. Rattlesnakes if you're unlucky." He nodded toward the horses. "I've got room for one more if you don't mind riding double." Mara hesitated. "Why would you help me?" "Why wouldn't I?" "You don't know me." "I know you walked out here in a torn wedding dress with no shoes and no plan," Rowan said. "That tells me enough." She studied his face. There was no pity in it, no judgment, just plain, blunt practicality. "All right," she said. He helped her onto the back of the larger horse, a sturdy bay mare with patient eyes. Mara's ruined dress bunched awkwardly around her legs. Rowan swung up in front of her, gathering the reins. "Hold on," he said. Mara wrapped her arms around his waist. The horse started forward, and the ravine fell away behind them. Bikit. Rowan's ranch was a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the prairie like they were trying to hide from the wind. A main house with a sagging porch, a barn missing half its roof, a corral with broken fence rails. Everything looked one bad storm away from collapse. Rowan dismounted and helped Mara down. Her legs nearly buckled. He caught her elbow, steadying her. "Inside," he said. "You need food." The house was small, one main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, and a door leading to what Mara assumed was a bedroom. It smelled like coffee and wood smoke and loneliness. Rowan lit a lamp and set it on the table. "Sit." Mara obeyed. Her body felt like it belonged to someone else, heavy, slow, disconnected. Rowan pulled a tin of jerky from a shelf, along with a loaf of bread that had seen better days. He set both in front of her, then pumped water into a basin and handed her a cloth. "Clean up," he said. "I'll see if I can find you something that isn't a wedding dress." He disappeared into the bedroom. Mara tore into the bread like an animal, barely chewing. The jerky was tough and salty and perfect. She ate until her stomach stopped cramping, then used the cloth to wipe the dust and dried sweat from her face and arms. When Rowan came back, he was carrying a bundle of clothes. "These were my wife's," he said quietly. "She was about your size." Mara froze. "Your wife?" "She died 2 years ago. Fever." He set the clothes on the table. They're just sitting in a trunk. Might as well be useful. He turned his back, giving her privacy. Mara stood on shaking legs and stripped off the ruined wedding dress, letting it fall to the floor in a heap of torn lace and broken dreams. She pulled on the clothes Rowan had given her, a simple cotton blouse, a long skirt, a leather belt to hold it up. They fit well enough, better than the wedding dress ever had. "Thank you," she said. Rowan turned back around. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You'll stay the night," he said. It wasn't a question. "Tomorrow, I'll take you wherever you need to go." "I don't have anywhere to go." "Then you'll figure it out in the morning." He pulled a bedroll from the corner and spread it out near the fireplace. "You take the bed. I'll sleep out here." Mara wanted to argue, but exhaustion had her by the throat. She nodded and walked into the small bedroom. It was barely big enough for a narrow bed and a trunk. The window was open, letting in the cool night air. She lay down on the bed without bothering to pull back the quilt. The mattress was lumpy, the pillow flat, but it felt like heaven. Outside, she could hear Rowan moving around, the clink of a bottle, the scrape of a chair. She closed her eyes. For the first time in years, Mara Holloway slept without dreaming. Butkis. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of voices. Mara sat up, disoriented. Sunlight streamed through the window. Her body ached in a dozen places, feet, legs, ribs where the corset had dug in. She swung her legs out of bed and stood, wincing. The voices were coming from outside. She walked to the bedroom door and eased it open. Rowan was standing on the porch, talking to two men on horseback. One was older, gray-haired, with a face like a hatchet. The other was younger, maybe 20, with nervous eyes and a rifle across his saddle. "I'm telling you, Mercer, you're 3 months behind," the older man said. "The bank's not running a charity." "I'm aware of that, Calloway." Rowan's voice was calm, but Mara could hear the steel underneath. "I've got a buyer lined up for 30 head. Soon as the sale goes through, you'll get your money. That's what you said last month. And I meant it last month. Buyer backed out. Not my fault." Calloway leaned forward in his saddle. "You've got until the end of August. After that, the bank forecloses. And I don't care if you've got a buyer or not." Rowan didn't flinch. "Understood." The two men rode off. Rowan stood on the porch for a long moment, staring after them. Then he turned and saw Mara in the doorway. "You're up," he said. "Who were they?" "Bankmen." He walked past her into the house and poured himself a cup of coffee. "I owe them money I don't have, same as everyone else out here." Mara followed him inside. "How much?" "Enough that I'll lose the ranch if I can't pay." "How long do you have?" 6 weeks. She sat down at the table. "What happens if you lose it?" Rowan took a long drink of coffee. "I start over somewhere else. Or I don't." He set the cup down. "Either way, it's not your problem." But Mara was already thinking. 6 weeks, 30 head of cattle, a buyer who'd backed out. "Show me the ledgers," she said. Rowan frowned. "What?" "Your financial records, ledgers, whatever you use to track sales and expenses." "Why?" "Because I can read." She met his eyes. "And I'm good with numbers." He studied her for a moment. Then he walked to a shelf, pulled down a battered leather book, and dropped it on the table in front of her. Mara opened it. The pages were a mess. Smudged ink, crossed out entries, numbers that didn't add up. She flipped through slowly, her mind already working. "You sold 40 head in March," she said. "Yeah." "At $12 a head." "Yeah. That's $480, but you only recorded 300. Rowan leaned over her shoulder. "That's wrong. The buyer paid in full. Then where's the rest of the money?" He stared at the page. "I don't know." Mara kept reading. May, June, July. Every month, the same pattern. Sales recorded for less than they were worth. Money disappearing into thin air. "Someone's stealing from you," she said quietly. Rowan's jaw tightened. "Who?" "I don't know yet, but whoever it is, they're good. They've been skimming just enough that you wouldn't notice unless you went looking." She looked up at him. "Do you trust your ranch hands?" "I only have one left. Kid named Sam. He's been with me since before my wife died." "What about your buyers?" "Different men every time. I don't deal with them directly. I go through a broker." "Who's the broker?" Rowan's face went cold. "Vale." Mara's blood turned to ice. Gideon Vale? You know him? He's the one who stopped my wedding. Rowan sat down heavily in the chair across from her. Then we've got a bigger problem than I thought. Over the next 3 days, Mara didn't leave the ranch. She pored over Rowan's ledgers, cross-referencing every sale, every payment, every expense. She asked questions. She made lists. She filled page after page with notes in tight, precise handwriting. Rowan watched her work with a mixture of fascination and wariness. You didn't learn this on a farm, he said one evening, as Mara sat at the table surrounded by papers. My mother taught me, Mara said, without looking up. She worked as a clerk before she married my father. She said a woman who could read and cipher would never starve. Smart woman. She was. Mara set down her pencil, until she married a man who gambled away everything she'd saved. Rowan didn't say anything. Mara rubbed her eyes. Vale's network is bigger than you think. He's not just a broker. He controls the water rights, the grazing contracts, the supply lines. If you want to sell cattle in this territory, you go through him. And if he decides you're a problem, he can choke you out without lifting a finger. So what do? We prove he's stealing, and then we take it to someone who can stop him. Who? The sheriff's on Vale's payroll? So's half the town council. Mara thought of the federal marshal she'd heard about, a man named Harding who traveled the circuit, investigating land fraud and contract disputes. There's someone, she said, but we'll need proof. Real proof. Not just missing numbers in a ledger. Rowan leaned back in his chair. How do we get that? Mara smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. We set a trap. The plan was simple. Rowan would arrange another cattle sale, this time with a buyer Mara had found through a contact in Dodge City. A legitimate buyer, not one of Vale's men. They'd document everything. The head count, the agreed price, the payment method. And if Vale's network tried to skim again, they'd catch them in the act. But they needed one more thing. Witnesses. Mara rode into Grafton for the first time since the wedding. She wore Rowan's wife's clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed her face. She tied the horse outside the general store and walked inside. Mrs. Gentry was behind the counter weighing flour. She looked up when the door opened and her face went pale. Mara Holloway. Mrs. Gentry. Mara walked to the counter. I need to ask you a question. I don't think... Do you know what your husband does for Gideon Vale? Mrs. Gentry's mouth snapped shut. He falsifies contracts, Mara continued quietly. He changes the numbers on bills of sale so Vale's men can pocket the difference. He's been doing it for 2 years. And if Vale goes down, your husband goes down with him. Mrs. Gentry's hands shook. You can't prove that. I can, and I will. Mara leaned closer. Unless you help me. What do you want? I want you to tell me every other person in this town who's working for Vale. Every clerk, every ranch hand, every shopkeeper who's taking his money. And then I want you to tell the marshal when he comes through. He'll kill us. He'll kill you anyway, the moment you stop being useful. Mara straightened. This is your chance to get out. Mrs. Gentry stared at her. Then slowly, she nodded. Next. By the end of the week, Mara had a list. 15 names, men and women who'd been part of Vale's network knowingly or not. Some were scared, some were greedy. All of them were tired of being trapped. She also had something else, a letter from the federal marshal confirming he'd be in Grafton in 10 days. She showed it to Rowan that night. It's happening, she said. Rowan looked at the letter, then at her. You sure about this? No. She folded the letter carefully. But I'm doing it anyway. He nodded. Then so am I. Outside, the wind picked up. In the distance, thunder rumbled. The storm was coming. The cattle sale was set for Thursday morning. Mara spent the days leading up to it going over every detail until her eyes burned and her head throbbed. She checked the head count 3 times. She verified the buyer's credentials twice. She made sure the payment would be made in front of witnesses, in cash, with a signed receipt that couldn't be altered. Rowan handled the physical work. He repaired the broken sections of the corral fence, reinforced the gates, and spent hours moving cattle from the far pastures closer to the ranch. His one remaining ranch hand, Sam, worked alongside him without asking questions. The kid was 19, all elbows and nerves, with a mop of red hair that stuck out from under his hat like straw from a scarecrow. On Wednesday evening, Mara watched from the porch as Rowan and Sam drove the last group of cattle into the holding pen. Dust rose in thick clouds. The animals bellowed and jostled against each other, their ribs showing through patchy hides. They were thinner than they should have been. The drought had turned the grass brittle and yellow, and there wasn't enough water to go around. Rowan climbed over the fence and walked toward the house, pulling off his gloves. His shirt was soaked through with sweat. Dirt streaked his face and arms. 32 head, he said when he reached the porch. 2 more than I thought. Mara nodded. The buyer's expecting 30. We'll sell him 32 and see if he tries to change the count. And if he does, then we know Vale's gotten to him. Rowan sat down on the porch steps and wiped his face with his bandana. You really think this is going to work? I think it has to. He looked at her. That's not the same thing. No, Mara admitted. It's not. Sam appeared from the direction of the barn, leading his horse. I'm heading into town, boss. Need anything? Rowan shook his head. Be back before dark. Yes, sir. Sam swung into the saddle and rode off, kicking up dust. Mara waited until he was out of earshot. You trust him? Sam? He's a good kid. Works hard. Doesn't ask for much. That's not what I asked. Rowan was quiet for a moment. I trust him as much as I trust anyone these days. He stood and brushed off his pants, which isn't saying much. Inside the house, Mara pulled out the ledger one more time. She went through the numbers again, line by line, comparing Rowan's records to the contracts she'd managed to get copies of. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Vale's men would buy cattle at the agreed price, then report a lower number to the rancher. The difference went into their pockets. It was simple, effective, and nearly impossible to prove unless you had both sets of records. Mara had one set. She needed the other. There's a ledger, she said, not looking up. Somewhere in Vale's office or with one of his brokers. It'll have the real numbers, the ones they don't show us. Rowan poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. And how do you plan to get it? I don't know yet. That's comforting. Mara set down her pencil. Do you have a better idea? He didn't answer. She rubbed her temples. The headache that had been building all day was getting worse. We need leverage, something that makes Vale come to us instead of the other way around. He's not going to come here. He doesn't need to. He's got the whole territory sewn up. Then we make him need to. Rowan sat down across from her. How? Mara stared at the ledger. An idea was forming, half-baked and dangerous, but it was better than nothing. What if we spread a rumor? What kind of rumor? That we've got proof, documents, contracts, everything we need to bring him down. Rowan frowned. But we don't. He doesn't know that. And what happens when he calls our bluff? Then we'd better make sure we're not bluffing by the time he does. Rowan leaned back in his chair. You're talking about baiting him. I'm talking about making him nervous. Nervous people make mistakes. He studied her face. You've thought about this a lot. I've had time. And what happens if he doesn't make a mistake? What if he just sends men to kill us? Mara met his eyes. Then we'd better be ready for that too. The next morning, Rowan left before dawn to meet the buyer at the railhead in Grafton. Mara stayed behind, ostensibly to finish organizing the paperwork. In truth, she wanted to search the ranch more thoroughly. If Vale's men had been skimming profits for years, there had to be other signs. Altered receipts, missing invoices, something. She started in the barn. It was dim and smelled like hay and manure and old leather. Sunlight slanted through the gaps in the walls, cutting the darkness into stripes. She went through the tack room first, checking saddlebags and toolboxes. Nothing. Then she moved to the storage loft, where Rowan kept old equipment and supplies. That's where she found it. A wooden crate shoved into the corner, half buried under a canvas tarp. She pulled the tarp aside and pried open the lid. Inside were papers, dozens of them. Contracts, bills of sale, receipts, all bundled together with twine. Mara lifted out the first bundle and untied it. The top document was a contract for the sale of 50 head of cattle dated 2 years prior. The buyer's name was listed as J. Whitman. The price was $8 per head. She flipped to the next page. Another contract, same buyer, same price. But the handwriting was different, sloppier, and the date had been changed. She held it up to the light. The ink was a slightly different shade, a forgery. She went through the rest of the bundle. Half the documents were originals. The other half were copies, altered to show lower prices and smaller quantities. She found contracts where entire sales had been erased from the record, receipts that had been rewritten, payment vouchers that didn't match the amounts Rowan had noted in his ledger. It was all here. Every piece of evidence she needed. Except it wasn't enough. These documents proved someone had been stealing from Rowan, but they didn't prove it was Vale. She needed something that connected him directly to the fraud. A letter. A signed order. Anything. She kept searching. At the bottom of the crate, beneath the last bundle of papers, she found a leather folder. It was dusty and cracked, the kind of thing someone would use to carry important documents. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter, written in neat, precise handwriting. Mercer, adjust the August contracts as discussed. Reduce reported headcount by 15%. Forward the difference to the usual account. Destroy this letter after reading. V. Mara's hands shook. V. Vale. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Then she replaced the bundles in the crate, covered it with the tarp, and climbed down from the loft. When Rowan returned that afternoon, Mara was waiting on the porch. He dismounted and tied his horse to the rail, his face grim. "The buyer didn't show," he said. Mara stood. "What?" "He sent a telegram this morning, said something came up, couldn't make it." "Did he reschedule?" "No." Mara's stomach sank. "Vale got to him," Rowan nodded. "That'd be my guess." She pulled the letter from her pocket and handed it to him. "I found this in the barn." He read it, his expression darkening with every word. When he finished, he looked up at her. "Where was it?" "In a crate in the loft, hidden under a bunch of forged contracts." "Why would someone hide this here?" "I don't know. Maybe they were planning to use it as leverage and forgot about it. Maybe it was insurance. Either way, it's proof." Rowan folded the letter and handed it back to her. "It's proof Vale's involved, but it's not enough to bring him down. One letter could have been forged, could have been taken out of context. Then we get more." "How?" Mara looked toward the horizon, where the sun was starting to sink behind the distant hills. "We go to his office." Rowan stared at her. "You want to break into Gideon Vale's office. I want to find the real ledger, the one that shows every rancher he's stolen from, every contract he's altered, every dollar he's skimmed." "And you think he just keeps that sitting around?" "I think men like Vale are arrogant. They don't expect to get caught. So yeah, I think he keeps records, and I think there's somewhere we can find them." Rowan shook his head. "This is insane." "You have a better idea?" He didn't. That night they rode into Grafton under cover of darkness. The town was quiet. Most of the buildings were dark, their windows like empty eyes staring out at the street. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A horse whinnied from the livery stable. Vale's office was on the second floor of the bank building, accessible by an external staircase on the side. Mara and Rowan tied their horses behind the general store and approached on foot, keeping to the shadows. The staircase was old and creaked with every step. Mara winced, certain someone would hear them. But the street remained empty. At the top of the stairs, Rowan tried the door. Locked. "Can you pick it?" Mara whispered. He gave her a look. "Do I look like a burglar? Do you want to get in or not?" He pulled a knife from his belt and worked the blade into the gap between the door and the frame. After a few seconds of jiggling, the lock clicked. The door swung open. Inside, the office was dark and smelled like cigar smoke and old paper. Mara pulled out the small lantern she'd brought and lit it, keeping the flame low. The room was spacious, dominated by a large desk covered in neat stacks of documents. Bookshelves lined one wall. A safe sat in the corner. "Start with the desk," Mara said. "I'll check the shelves." They worked quickly and quietly. Mara scanned the spines of the books, looking for anything that might be a ledger. Most were law books and financial manuals. A few were personal, novels, a collection of essays. Nothing useful. "Mara." She turned. Rowan was standing by the desk, holding a thick leather-bound book. "Is this it?" She took it from him and opened it. Page after page of entries, written in the same precise handwriting as the letter. Names, dates, amounts, every rancher in the territory, every sale, every dollar stolen. "This is it," she breathed. A voice behind them said, I was wondering when you'd show up. Mara spun around. Gideon Vale stood in the doorway, flanked by two men with rifles. He looked calm, almost amused. Miss Holloway, he said, breaking and entering. I'm disappointed. Mara's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to stay still. We're taking this to the marshal. Are you? Vale stepped into the room. Because from where I'm standing, you're trespassing in my office with stolen property. Stolen from you, maybe, but you stole it first. Vale smiled. Prove it. Rowan moved in front of Mara, his hand on the knife at his belt. Let us go, Vale. I don't think so. Vale nodded to the men with rifles. Take the ledger and make sure they don't leave. One of the men stepped forward. Rowan lunged. The room erupted into chaos. Rowan slammed into the first man, driving him back into the wall. The rifle clattered to the floor. Mara grabbed the ledger and ran for the door, but the second man blocked her path. Don't, he said, raising his rifle. Mara threw the lantern at him. The glass shattered. Oil splashed across his chest. The flame caught instantly, and the man screamed, stumbling backward. Mara shoved past him and out the door. Behind her, she heard Rowan shout, Go! She didn't look back. She ran down the stairs, clutching the ledger to her chest, her boots pounding on the wooden steps. At the bottom, she heard gunfire, a single shot echoing through the night. She stopped. Rowan! No answer. She turned, torn between running back and running away. The ledger felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Another gunshot. Then voices. Men shouting. Mara ran. She made it to the horses and untied hers with shaking hands. She swung into the saddle and kicked the animal into a gallop, tearing through the streets of Grafton like the devil himself was on her heels. She didn't stop until she was miles outside of town, deep in the scrub where the moonlight barely reached. Only then did she pull the horse to a halt and look back. The horizon glowed faintly orange. Fire. Vale's office was burning. Mara sat in the saddle, gasping for breath, the ledger clutched against her chest. Her hands were shaking. Her mind was screaming. Rowan, she'd left him. She turned the horse around, but even as she did, she knew it was too late. Going back now would mean getting caught, getting killed, and the ledger would be lost. She couldn't save him. Not tonight. So she rode toward the ranch, alone in the dark, hating herself with every mile. When she finally reached Rowan's property, the sky was starting to lighten in the east. She dismounted on trembling legs and led the horse to the barn. Inside, she collapsed onto a bale of hay and let the ledger fall from her hands. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there, staring at nothing, while the sun came up and the world kept turning. Hours passed, maybe minutes. She couldn't tell. The sound of hoofbeats brought her back to herself. Mara grabbed the ledger and ran to the barn door, her heart in her throat. A rider was approaching, alone, slumped in the saddle. Rowan. Mara ran to him as he dismounted, nearly falling. His shirt was torn and scorched. Blood seeped through a makeshift bandage wrapped around his left arm. You're alive, she said, her voice breaking. Barely. He winced as she helped him toward the house. Vale's men set the fire to cover their tracks. I got out through the back window. Your arm, Bullet grazed me. I'll live. He sank into a chair at the kitchen table, his face pale. Did you get it? Mara set the ledger in front of him. Every page. Rowan stared at it. Then he started laughing. It was a harsh, bitter sound, but it was real. We did it, he said. We actually did it. Mara sat down across from him. Now we have to make sure it counts. Over the next 2 days, Mara and Rowan prepared for the marshal's arrival. They made copies of the most damning pages from Vale's ledger. They organized the forged contracts. They compiled a list of every rancher who'd been defrauded, cross-referenced with dates and amounts. Mara also sent word to the people she'd contacted in Grafton. Mrs. Gentry, the clerk at the land office, the blacksmith's son who'd been forced to falsify invoices. One by one, they agreed to testify. The marshal arrived on Saturday morning. His name was Thomas Harding, and he looked like someone who'd spent his entire life on the wrong side of hope. Weathered face, gray beard, eyes that had seen too much and believed too little. He sat at Rowan's kitchen table and listened while Mara laid out the case. She showed him the ledger, the forged contracts, the letter signed with Vale's initial. She explained the pattern of theft, the network of complicit clerks and brokers, the the systematic looting of every small rancher in the territory. When she finished, Harding leaned back in his chair and rubbed his jaw. This is a hell of a story, Miss Holloway. It's not a story, it's fact. Facts are only as good as the people willing to stand behind them. You got witnesses? 7, maybe more. Harding nodded slowly. And you're sure about this? Because once I bring Vale in, there's no walking it back. He's got money. He's got connections. If this falls apart in court, he'll bury you. Mara met his eyes. I'm sure. Harding stood. All right then, I'll bring him in tomorrow. You and Mercer be ready to testify. After the marshal left, Rowan poured himself a drink. His hand was still bandaged, the wound healing slowly. You think he'll actually do it? He asked. He doesn't have a choice. We gave him everything he needs. Vale's not going to come quietly. I know. Rowan downed the whiskey in one swallow. Then we'd better be ready. That night, Mara couldn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. Tomorrow, everything would change. Either Vale would fall, or they would. She thought about her father, about the farm she'd lost, about the church full of silent faces who'd watched her humiliation and done nothing. She thought about Thaddeus, who tried to buy her like livestock, and she thought about the wedding dress, torn and discarded in the dirt. She'd come a long way from that church, but the fight wasn't over yet. The next morning, riders appeared on the horizon. Mara spotted them from the porch, 6 men, moving fast, kicking up dust. At the front rode Gideon Vale, his suit jacket flapping in the wind. Rowan, she called. He came out of the barn, saw the riders, and swore. That's not the marshal. No, it's Vale. They'd expected this, prepared for it, but knowing it was coming didn't make it easier. The riders pulled up in front of the house. Vale dismounted smoothly, his face calm and cold. Miss Holloway, Mr. Mercer. He nodded to each of them in turn. I believe you have something that belongs to me. You mean the ledger that proves you've been stealing from every rancher in the territory? Mara said. That belongs to the marshal now. Vale's smile didn't reach his eyes. The marshal's not coming. Mara's blood went cold. What did you do? I didn't do anything. He simply reconsidered after I explained the situation. Vale stepped closer. You see, Marshal Harding is a reasonable man. He understands that accusations without credible witnesses are just noise. We have witnesses. Had, past tense. Vale's voice was soft, almost kind. Mrs. Gentry left town this morning. The land office clerk decided his memory wasn't as clear as he thought. The others, well, let's just say they've reconsidered their positions. Rowan's hand moved toward his rifle, propped against the porch railing. One of Vale's men raised his own rifle in response. I wouldn't, Vale said mildly. Mara stepped forward. You can't make this go away. Even if you kill us, the ledger's already in the marshal's hands. The evidence exists. Evidence can disappear. Witnesses can recant. Marshals can be persuaded. Vale tilted his head. You fought hard, Miss Holloway. I respect that. But you've lost. Not yet. Vale's expression hardened. Give me the ledger. Walk away. I'll even let you keep the ranch, Mercer. Call it a professional courtesy. And if we refuse, Rowan asked, then I stop being courteous. For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of dust and distant rain. Storm clouds were building on the western horizon, dark and heavy. Mara looked at Rowan. He looked back at her. She saw the same calculation in his eyes that she felt in her gut. They were outgunned, outmaneuvered, out of options. But she'd walked away from one trap already. She wasn't about to walk into another. No, she said. Vale sighed. I was hoping you'd be reasonable. He raised his hand, and the sky caught fire. The wildfire came from the west like a living thing, born from weeks of drought and a single spark from one of Vale's men. Mara saw the smoke first, a dark plume rising against the storm clouds, and then the orange glow spreading across the dry grassland faster than a horse could run. Fire! She screamed. Vale's men turned in their saddles, and for a brief moment even Vale looked uncertain. The wind was pushing the flames directly toward the ranch, consuming everything in its path. The air filled with the crackle of burning grass and the acrid stench of smoke. Get back to town! Vale shouted to his men. But the horses were already spooked, rearing and snorting. One of the riders lost control and his mount bolted, throwing him into the dirt. Rowan grabbed Mara's arm. "The cattle!" She looked toward the holding pen where 32 head of cattle were trapped behind wooden rails. The animals were already panicking, pressing against the fence, their bellows cutting through the roar of approaching flame. "We have to get them out." Mara ran toward the corral without thinking. Behind her, she heard Rowan cursing, heard Vale shouting orders that no one was listening to anymore. The fire had turned everything into chaos. The heat hit her before she reached the fence, a wall of scorching air that made her eyes water. Smoke rolled across the ground in thick waves. She could barely see 10 feet ahead. Rowan caught up to her at the gate. "Open it and get clear. They'll scatter. Better scattered than dead." He threw the gate open and the cattle poured through like a flood, wild-eyed and terrified. One nearly trampled Mara as it charged past. She stumbled backward, lost her footing, and fell hard on her side. The world spun. Through the smoke, she saw the barn catch fire, flames licking up the dried wood like it was paper. She saw Vale's remaining men riding away at full gallop, leaving their employer standing alone in front of the house. She saw Rowan trying to reach her, shouting something she couldn't hear over the roar. And then she saw the fence line. The fire had jumped the creek bed and was racing toward the main corral where Rowan kept his breeding stock. A dozen animals, trapped. The wooden posts were already smoking. Mara forced herself to her feet. Her side screamed in protest, but she ignored it. She ran toward the corral, pulling her borrowed shirt up over her nose and mouth. The smoke was so thick now she could barely breathe. She reached the fence and started working the latch. The metal was already hot enough to burn her fingers. She yanked her sleeve down over her hand and tried again. The latch stuck. "Come on, come on!" A hand closed over hers. Rowan, his face blackened with soot, blood still seeping through the bandage on his arm. Together they wrenched the latch free and shoved the gate open. But the cattle wouldn't move. They huddled together at the far end of the corral, too terrified to understand they had an escape route. "They're not going!" Mara shouted. Rowan grabbed a length of rope from a fence post and started toward the animals. "We have to drive them." "There's no time." He didn't listen. He waded into the herd, slapping flanks with the rope, yelling himself hoarse. Mara joined him, pushing and shoving at the massive bodies. The animals were rigid with fear, pressing so tightly together she could barely move between them. A terrible crack split the air. One of the fence posts, weakened by fire, collapsed inward. Flames raced along the dry wood. "Rowan, get out!" But he was at the back of the herd now, forcing the last few animals toward the gate. The lead cow finally broke, charging through the opening, and the others followed in a stampede. Rowan turned to run. The second post gave way. The entire fence section collapsed on top of him. Mara screamed his name and ran back in. The burning wood had pinned him across the chest and legs. She grabbed the post with both hands and pulled. It didn't budge. The flames were inches from his face. "Leave it!" Rowan gasped. "Get out!" "Shut up!" She braced her feet and pulled again, putting everything she had into it. The post shifted. Not much, but enough. Rowan twisted and dragged himself free, his shirt smoking. Mara grabbed him under the arms and hauled him toward the gate. They made it 3 steps before the smoke swallowed them completely. Mara's lungs burned. Her eyes streamed tears. She couldn't see anything, could barely feel Rowan's weight as she half carried, half dragged him forward. Her foot hit something and she fell, taking Rowan down with her. She landed on her knees in the dirt, coughing so hard she thought she'd break apart. Strong hands lifted her. Through the haze she saw a figure, not Rowan, someone else. Gideon Vale. He was supporting Rowan with one arm and reaching for her with the other. His face was covered in ash, his expensive suit ruined. He didn't say anything, just pulled them both toward clearer air. They stumbled out of the smoke together and collapsed near the house. Mara gulped air, her throat raw, her entire body shaking. Beside her, Rowan was coughing violently, each breath a ragged wheeze. Vale stood over them, breathing hard. "You're both insane." Mara looked up at him through streaming eyes. "You started this." "My man started it. I told him to fire a warning shot, not set the whole damn prairie ablaze." Vale wiped soot from his face. "For what it's worth, I didn't want it to go this far." "Then stop it." "I can't stop a wildfire, Miss Holloway. Neither can you." But Mara was already looking past him, her mind racing despite the chaos. The fire was moving northeast, driven by the wind. It had already consumed the barn and most of the outbuildings, but the house might still be saved if they could create a firebreak. She forced herself to stand. "Where's your horse?" Vale frowned. "What?" "Your horse. Where is it?" "Tied near the house. Why?" Mara staggered toward the animal, moving on instinct. The horse was terrified, pulling against the rail, whites of its eyes showing. She untied it and swung into the saddle. "What are you doing?" Vale demanded. "The creek bed," Mara said. "Half a mile north. The ground's sandy, nothing to burn. If we can turn the herd that direction, drive them across the firebreak, we might save some of them." Rowan pushed himself up on one elbow. "You can't do that alone." "Then come with me." Vale looked between them like they'd both lost their minds. "The cattle are already scattered. You'll never round them up in this smoke." "Not all of them." Mara pointed south, where she could just make out dark shapes moving through the haze. "Some of them are still together. They're following the lead cow. If we can turn her, the others will follow." It was a desperate plan. Probably a stupid plan, but it was the only plan they had. Rowan staggered to his feet, wincing. "I'm going." Vale stared at them both for a long moment. Then he swore under his breath and whistled. His horse appeared from around the side of the house, reins trailing. He mounted in one smooth motion. "This is the dumbest thing I've ever done," he muttered. The three of them rode toward the scattered herd. The smoke was thinner here, blown south by the wind, but the heat was still brutal. Mara's borrowed clothes were soaked with sweat. Her hands, raw from pulling at the fence post, bled onto the reins. She spotted the lead cow first, a big brindle with a white face, moving steadily south with about 15 other animals trailing behind her. They were heading directly into the path of the fire. "There!" Mara kicked her horse into a gallop, racing ahead of the herd. She needed to get in front of the lead cow, turn her before she led the others into the flames. The ground was uneven, pocked with prairie dog holes and loose rock. The horse stumbled but caught itself. Mara leaned low over its neck, urging it faster. She pulled ahead of the herd and turned the horse broadside, blocking the lead cow's path. The animal didn't slow down, just lowered her head and kept coming. "Move, damn you!" Mara waved her arms. The cow ignored her. A rope whipped past Mara's head and settled around the cow's horns. Rowan, riding hard on her left, had lassoed the animal and was already turning his horse away, forcing the cow to change direction. The animal bellowed in protest, but her momentum carried her around. The rest of the herd followed, turning north toward the creek bed. "Keep them moving," Rowan shouted. Mara rode behind the herd, pushing stragglers, while Rowan led from the front. Vale appeared on the right flank, driving several animals that had started to break away back into the group. The smoke thickened again. Mara's eyes burned so badly she could barely keep them open. She could hear the fire now, a constant roar punctuated by the crack of exploding wood as flames consumed everything they touched. The creek bed appeared ahead, a dark gash in the earth. The lead cow balked at the edge, unwilling to descend the steep bank. Rowan rode down first, pulling her after him. The animal slid and scrambled but made it to the bottom. The others followed in a chaos of dust and terrified lowing. Mara counted heads as they descended. 14. They'd saved 14 out of 32. It would have to be enough. She slid from the saddle at the bottom of the creek bed and leaned against the sandy bank, her legs trembling so badly they wouldn't hold her. Rowan dismounted nearby and sat down hard, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. Vale stayed on his horse, looking back the way they'd come. "The fire's slowing," he said after a moment. "Wind's dying down." Mara followed his gaze. He was right. The flames were still burning, but without the wind to drive them, they were consuming fuel more slowly. The worst of it seemed to have passed. They stayed in the creek bed until the smoke began to clear. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say. The fire had said everything that mattered. When it was finally safe to return, they rode back to the ranch in silence. What they found was devastation. The barn was gone, reduced to a pile of smoking timbers and ash. The outbuildings had collapsed. The corrals were destroyed. The house still stood, scorched and battered, but intact. Mara dismounted and walked through the ruins. Her feet were numb. Her mind was numb. She couldn't quite process what she was seeing. Rowan stood in front of what used to be the barn, staring at the wreckage. 2 years? He said quietly. I spent 2 years trying to hold this place together. We can rebuild, Mara said, though she didn't know if she believed it. With what? I've got 14 head of cattle and a house that's barely standing. The bank's not going to give me time to rebuild. He turned to look at her. It's over. Vale, still mounted, cleared his throat. For what it's worth, Mercer, I'll speak to Calloway at the bank. Tell him what happened here. It might buy you some time. Why would you do that? Vale's expression was unreadable. Because whatever you think of me, I'm not in the business of destroying men who've already been destroyed. He shifted in the saddle. And because Miss Holloway was right, this has gone too far. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather folder. Mara recognized it immediately. The ledger. I'm keeping this, Vale said. But I'm also done. As of today, I'm closing my operations in this territory. The contracts are void. The debts are forgiven. Any rancher who wants out from under my network is free to go. Mara stared at him. Just like that? Just like that. Vale looked down at the ledger in his hands. I came to this territory to make money. I did that. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being business and started being something uglier. He met her eyes. You made me see that, Miss Holloway. I don't particularly like it, but I see it. What about the marshal? Rowan asked. The investigation? There won't be one. I've already spoken to Harding. He's agreed to drop the matter in exchange for my cooperation in other cases. Vale tucked the ledger back into his jacket. You won't get your public trial, but you'll get your freedom. Sometimes that has to be enough. He turned his horse toward the road. I'd wish you luck, but I suspect you don't need it. You're both too stubborn to fail for long. He rode away without looking back. Mara watched him go, feeling something she couldn't quite name. Not satisfaction, not victory, just exhaustion and the faint, fragile sense that maybe the worst was finally over. Do you believe him? Rowan asked. I don't know. Mara sat down on the porch steps, her body finally giving up. But I'm too tired to care right now. Rowan lowered himself down beside her, grimacing as his injured arm protested. They sat in silence, staring at the ruins, while the sun climbed higher and the smoke drifted away on the dying wind. After a while, Rowan said, Thank you. For what? For not leaving me under that fence. Mara looked at him. His face was covered in soot and blood, his shirt torn and scorched, his eyes red-rimmed from smoke. He looked like he'd been through a war. You pulled me out of a ravine, she said. I think we're even. I'm serious, Mara. You could have run, should have run. Instead, you came back for cattle that weren't even yours, and a man who can barely pay his own debts. The cattle were worth saving. And me? She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. I've spent my whole life being told what I was worth, how much land I came with, how useful I'd be to someone else's plans. Nobody ever asked what I wanted, what I needed. She looked at him. You did. You asked. And then you let me decide for myself. Rowan was quiet for a moment. You're not going back to Grafton, are you? No. What will you do? I don't know yet. She looked out at the scorched prairie, at the distant horizon where the land stretched on forever. But I'm done being something that happens to other people. From now on, I happen to the world. Rowan smiled. It was a tired, crooked thing, but it was genuine. I believe you. They sat on the porch as the day burned itself out. Two people who'd lost almost everything, sitting in the ruins of a life that was gone but not quite finished. The fire had taken the barn and the fences and the sense of security Rowan had tried so hard to build, but it hadn't taken them. And sometimes, Mara thought, that was enough to start with. The next morning, Marshal Harding arrived with a wagon and 3 men. They helped pull down the most dangerous parts of the burned structures and started clearing debris. Harding didn't mention Vale or the ledger or the investigation that would never happen. He just worked alongside them, quiet and efficient, until the worst of the wreckage was cleared away. Before he left, he pulled Mara aside. Vale kept his word. The bank's giving Mercer a 6-month extension on the loan. No interest. That's generous of them. That's fear. They know what you two were willing to do to expose the fraud. They don't want you digging any deeper into their own business. Harding studied her face. You made powerful people very nervous, Miss Holloway. That's not always a safe thing to be. I'm not interested in being safe. I can see that. He tipped his hat. Good luck. I suspect you'll do just fine. Over the following weeks, Mara and Rowan began the slow work of rebuilding. They salvaged what they could from the burned barn. They repaired sections of fence. They tracked down most of the scattered cattle and brought them back to the creek bed, where grazing was still decent despite the drought. Word spread through the territory about what had happened, about the fire, about Vale's withdrawal, about the woman who'd stood up to the most powerful man in 3 counties and walked away alive. People started showing up at the ranch. Other ranchers, small farmers, people who'd been ground down by debt and drought and Vale's network. They came to see if the stories were true. They came to offer help. Some came just to shake Mara's hand. Mrs. Gentry arrived one afternoon in a wagon loaded with supplies. "My husband left," she said without preamble. "Took all the money he'd saved and ran before anyone could ask questions. I'm selling the store." "I'm sorry," Mara said. Mrs. Gentry shook her head. "Don't be. I should have left him years ago." She handed Mara a bundle of letters. "These came for you, to the store, but they're addressed to you." Mara opened them one by one. 3 were from ranchers she'd never met, thanking her for exposing Vale's network. One was from a lawyer in Dodge City, offering to help her file a claim on her father's property. The last was from her mother. She opened it with shaking hands. The letter was brief. Her mother's handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged in places. She wrote that Mara's father had suffered a stroke shortly after the wedding. He was alive but weak, unable to work the farm. The debt to the Cattlemen's Association had come due. Unless Mara returned to help, they would lose everything. Mara read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. "Bad news?" Rowan asked. "My father's sick. The farm's being foreclosed." "Are you going back?" Mara looked at the ranch, at the rebuilt fence line, at the cattle grazing peacefully near the creek bed. "I don't know." That night, she lay awake thinking about her father, about the man who'd sold her to pay his debts, about the woman who'd stood silent in the church while Mara was humiliated. She thought about forgiveness, whether she owed it to them, whether she owed it to herself. By morning, she'd made her decision. She told Rowan over breakfast, "I'm going to Grafton. I need to settle things with my family. I'll come with you." "No, this is something I need to do alone." He didn't argue, just nodded and asked, "When will you be back?" "I don't know if I will be." Rowan set down his coffee cup. "What does that mean?" "It means I have to figure out what I want. What comes next? I can't do that here, not with everything that's happened." She met his eyes. "You understand, don't you?" "No," he said honestly, "but I'm not going to stop you." She left the next morning with a horse Rowan had given her and what little money she'd managed to save. The ride to Grafton took most of the day. When she arrived, the town looked exactly the same as it had the day she'd walked out of the church. Nothing had changed. Nothing except her. Her family's farm was 3 miles north. She found her mother in the garden, pulling weeds from between rows of struggling vegetables. The older woman looked up when Mara approached, her face weathered and tired. "You came," her mother said. "I got your letter." They stood looking at each other across the garden. There was so much Mara wanted to say, so much anger and hurt that had been building for years. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was simpler. "How is he?" "Weak. The doctor says he might recover, but it'll take time." Her mother wiped her hands on her apron. "We can't pay the debt, Mara. The farm's as good as gone." "I know." "If you could just talk to Thaddeus, convince him—" "No." Her mother's face crumpled. "Please, we have nowhere else to go." Mara felt the old familiar guilt rising, the pressure to fix things, to sacrifice herself for people who'd never protected her. She pushed it down. "I'll help you," she said, "but not by marrying someone I don't want, and not by giving up my future to save yours." "Then how?" "I'll find a way. Give me time." It took her 3 days. 3 days of riding to Dodge City, tracking down the lawyer who'd written to her, and negotiating a deal that made her head spin but felt right in her gut. She sold her claim to her father's property to a land development company for enough money to pay off the debt and leave her parents with a small sum to start over somewhere else. In return, she purchased a different piece of land. 40 acres on the other side of the county, near a reliable water source, with good grazing and room to grow. Land in her own name, not her father's, not a husband's, hers. When she returned to the farm to deliver the news, her father was sitting on the porch in a chair, his face slack on one side, his hands trembling. He looked at her without recognition. Her mother cried when Mara explained what she'd done. "You gave up your inheritance." "No, I traded it for something better." "What will you do now?" Mara looked at the farm, at the house where she'd grown up, feeling too big, too loud, too much. "I'm going to build something of my own." She stayed long enough to make sure her parents understood the arrangement, long enough to sign the papers and settle the debt. Then she rode back to Rowan's ranch to tell him she was leaving. She found him in the rebuilt barn, hammering new boards into place. He stopped when he saw her. "You're back," he said. "For now." She told him about Grafton, about her family, about the land she'd purchased. He listened without interrupting, his expression careful. When she finished, he set down the hammer. "So you're really going?" "Yes." "When?" "Tomorrow, probably. I need to start building before winter." Rowan nodded slowly. "Do you need help?" "I need to do this alone, Rowan. I need to prove I can. I'm not trying to stop you. I'm asking if you want help. There's a difference." Mara looked at him. This man who'd pulled her out of a ravine when he had every reason to leave her, who'd fought beside her against Vale's men, who'd nearly died in a fire trying to save livestock that would never make him rich. She thought about trust, about partnership, about the difference between being saved and being supported. "Yes," she said finally, "I'd like help, but I'm still the one building it. Wouldn't have it any other way." They left together a week later, after Rowan had arranged for Sam to watch the ranch and the remaining cattle. The 40 acres Mara had purchased was rougher than Rowan's land, rockier and more exposed, but the creek that ran through it was clear and cold and never seemed to run dry. They built a small cabin first, working from dawn until their hands bled and their backs screamed in protest. Mara learned to handle an axe, to notch logs, to think in terms of load-bearing walls and roof pitch. Rowan taught her what he knew and learned alongside her when they encountered problems neither of them had solved before. It wasn't easy. The work was brutal and the prairie didn't care about their determination. But every nail Mara drove, every board she cut and placed, belonged to her in a way nothing else ever had. By the time autumn arrived, the cabin had walls and a roof and a door that closed properly. It wasn't much. One room with a stone fireplace and a loft for sleeping, but it was solid. Mara stood in the doorway on the first morning after they'd finished, looking out at the land that stretched in every direction, and felt something settle in her chest that had been restless her entire life. Rowan came up beside her carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one without a word. They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the sun burn off the morning mist. "You did it," he said finally. "We did it." "No," he shook his head. "This is yours. I just helped with the hammering." Mara took a sip of coffee. It was too hot and bitter as hell, exactly the way she liked it. "What happens now?" "You tell me. It's your land." She'd been thinking about that question for weeks, turning it over in her mind while they worked. The cabin was done, but 40 acres was more than one person could manage alone. She needed livestock. She needed equipment. She needed a plan that went beyond simply surviving. "I want to raise cattle," she said. "Not huge herds like the big operations, something smaller, quality over quantity." Rowan nodded slowly. "That could work. You've got good water, decent grazing. The market's hungry for beef. I'll need to buy stock, and I'll need someone who knows what they're doing to help me get started." He looked at her sideways. "You asking me to stay?" "I'm asking if you want to. There's a difference." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Someone smart told me that once." "She sounds like she knows what she's talking about. Sometimes." He turned to face her fully. "I'll stay, but I need to go back to my ranch first. Close things up properly. Sam can't handle it alone through winter." Mara felt something twist in her stomach, sharp and unexpected. "How long will you be gone?" "A month? Maybe 6 weeks?" "That's a long time." "It is." He set his coffee cup on the porch rail they'd built just yesterday. "But I'll come back. If you want me to." She met his eyes. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen before, or maybe she'd seen it and chosen not to acknowledge it. Something that made her heart beat faster and her palms sweat despite the cold morning air. I want you to, she said quietly. Rowan reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. Good, because I don't think I could stay away if I tried. He left the next morning. Mara stood in front of the cabin and watched him ride away until he was just a dark speck against the horizon, and then nothing at all. The silence that followed felt enormous, pressing in from all sides. She went inside and looked around the empty cabin. Her cabin. Her land. Her future. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt lonely. She threw herself into work to fill the hours. She built a chicken coop and purchased 6 hens from a farmer 10 miles south. She cleared rocks from what would eventually be a garden. She rode into Dodge City and used the last of her money to buy 3 young heifers and a bull, all of them scraggly and half wild but cheap enough that she could afford them. Getting them back to her property was an education in humility. The bull didn't want to be led, and the heifers scattered every chance they got. By the time Mara finally got all 4 animals penned in the temporary corral she'd built near the creek, she was covered in bruises and mud and cow shit, and it was nearly dark. She sat down on a rock and laughed until tears ran down her face. This was ranching. This was freedom. This was what she'd fought for. The next day, a wagon appeared on the road. Mara watched it approach, wary. She wasn't expecting visitors, and she was too far from town for casual travelers. The wagon pulled up in front of the cabin and a woman climbed down. She was middle-aged, built solid, with iron gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Mara recognized her after a moment, Mrs. Brennan, who owned a boarding house in Grafton. "Miss Holloway," the woman said, nodding. "Mrs. Brennan, what brings you out here? Heard you were building something. Thought you might need supplies." She gestured to the wagon bed, which was loaded with sacks of flour, beans, and cornmeal, along with blankets, tools, and a crate of what looked like preserves. Mara stared. "I can't pay for all this." "Didn't ask you to. Consider it a loan. Pay me back when you can." Mrs. Brennan started unloading sacks. "Where do you want these?" Together they carried everything inside. When the wagon was empty, Mrs. Brennan stood in the cabin and looked around with a critical eye. "You need a proper stove," she said, "and more furniture. Can't live like a hermit out here." "I'm managing." "Managing isn't the same as living." Mrs. Brennan pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited. "I'm going to be direct with you, Miss Holloway. Word spread about what you did. Standing up to Vale, walking out on that farce of a wedding, building your own place instead of crawling back to your family." Mara leaned against the wall. And there are other women who'd like to do the same, women trapped in situations they can't see a way out of. Mrs. Brennan folded her hands in her lap. They need to see it's possible. They need an example. "I'm not an example. I'm just trying to survive." "That's exactly what makes you one." Mrs. Brennan stood. "I'm not asking you to do anything you're not already doing. Just know that people are watching. What you build here matters." She left before Mara could respond, climbing back into her wagon and driving away without looking back. Mara stood in the doorway long after the wagon had disappeared, thinking about what the older woman had said. She hadn't set out to be an example. She'd just been trying to escape a trap. But maybe that was the point. Maybe survival was its own form of rebellion. Over the following weeks, more people came. Some brought supplies. Others brought questions. A young woman named Sarah arrived one afternoon, riding bareback on a plow horse, and asked if Mara needed help with the ranch in exchange for a place to sleep and meals. She had a black eye and wouldn't say where she'd come from. Mara gave her a bedroll and put her to work mending fence. An older man named Henry showed up a few days later looking for work. He'd been a ranch hand most of his life, but arthritis had made it hard to keep up with the younger men. Mara hired him on the spot, paying him in room and board since she had no cash. By the time Rowan returned 6 weeks later, Mara's solitary cabin had become something else. Sarah slept in the loft. Henry had built himself a small shelter near the barn. The 3 of them worked together like a mismatched family, arguing over meals and taking turns with the harder chores. Rowan rode up in late afternoon and stopped his horse in front of the cabin, staring at the changes. The corral had been expanded. A vegetable garden was taking shape near the creek. Smoke rose from a chimney that hadn't existed when he'd left. Mara came out to meet him, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked thinner than he remembered, her face weathered by sun and wind, but her eyes were bright. "You came back," she said. "Said I would." He dismounted and tied his horse to the rail. Looks like you've been busy. Things changed. I can see that. He looked past her to where Sarah was hauling water from the creek, and Henry was working on what appeared to be the frame of a new structure. You building an army? More like a refuge. Mara gestured for him to follow her inside. Come on. I'll explain over supper. That night, the four of them ate together at the table Rowan and Mara had built weeks ago. Sarah was quiet, picking at her food and watching Rowan like she expected him to cause trouble. Henry talked enough for both of them, telling stories about cattle drives and broken bones and winters so cold your spit froze before it hit the ground. After the meal, Sarah and Henry retreated to their respective spaces, leaving Mara and Rowan alone. You've been collecting strays, Rowan said, helping her clean the dishes. They needed somewhere to go. I had space. It's more than that. You're building something. A community, maybe. Mara dried a plate and set it on the shelf. I didn't plan it. It just happened. Does it bother you? No. She thought about it. Actually, it feels right. Like this is what the land was meant for. Rowan dried his hands and turned to face her. I sold the ranch. Mara's heart stopped. What? Not all of it. I sold most of the land to a developer, kept 20 acres around the house, and used the money to pay off my debts. Then I sold the house and the remaining land to a young couple from Kansas City who want to try ranching. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket. This is the deed. It's done. Why didn't you tell me you were planning that? Because I wasn't sure I'd go through with it, and I didn't want to promise something I might not deliver. He set the paper on the table. I'm free now, Mara. No debts, no obligations. I can go anywhere, do anything. She understood what he wasn't saying, the question beneath the words. What do you want to do? She asked. Rowan stepped closer. I want to stay here, with you. Not as help. Not as a ranch hand, as a partner. Mara's throat tightened. Rowan, I'm not asking you to marry me. Not yet. I know you need your independence. I know you need to prove you can do this alone. He reached out and took her hand. But I'm asking you to let me stand beside you while you prove it. Let me be part of what you're building. She looked down at their joined hands, his rough and scarred, hers the same. They matched. I'm difficult, she said. I don't take orders well. I'm stubborn and I have a temper, and I don't know how to need people without resenting them for it. I know. And you still want to stay? I do. Mara pulled her hand free and turned away, her mind racing. She'd spent so long fighting against being owned, against being trapped in someone else's idea of what her life should be. The thought of letting someone in, of sharing what she'd built, felt dangerous, like opening a door she might not be able to close again. But she was tired of being alone, tired of pretending she didn't need anyone, tired of mistaking independence for isolation. She turned back to face him. If you stay, it's as equals. This is my land, my name on the deed. You don't get to make decisions for me. Agreed. And if I decide I need space, you give it to me. No questions. Agreed. And we don't tell people we're together. Not until I'm ready. Rowan frowned. Why not? Because the moment people know, they'll start treating this place like it's yours. They'll come to you with questions instead of me. They'll assume you're in charge. She crossed her arms. I've worked too hard to let that happen. He considered this. All right, we keep it quiet for now. But eventually, Mara, I want people to know. Not because I want credit, because I want them to know I'm proud to be with you. Something in her chest cracked open. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Rowan closed the distance between them and cupped her face in his hands. Can I kiss you now, or do you have more rules? I might have a few more. Tell me later. He kissed her, and for the first time in her life, Mara let herself fall without worrying about who would catch her. Winter came hard and fast that year. The first snow arrived in early November, blanketing the prairie in white and turning the morning chores into an endurance test. Mara, Rowan, Sarah, and Henry worked together to keep the livestock fed and the buildings maintained. They moved the cattle closer to the barn where they could be sheltered from the worst of the storms. They reinforced the chicken coop after a coyote attack. They burned through firewood faster than Henry could chop it. The work was relentless, but there was something good about it too. Something solid. They'd built a rhythm, the four of them, each person knowing their role without needing to be told. Sarah had a gift with animals and took charge of the livestock. Henry's experience made him invaluable for repairs and maintenance. Rowan handled the heavy labor, and Mara managed the planning, the supplies, the decisions that would determine whether they survived the winter. One night in late December, a blizzard hit with such force that they couldn't see the barn from the cabin windows. The wind howled like something alive, battering the walls and finding every crack to whistle through. They huddled near the fireplace, wrapped in blankets, while snow piled up against the door. "We should check the animals," Sarah said, her face tight with worry. "We can't," Mara told her. "We'd freeze to death before we made it halfway there." "But they'll be scared." "They'll be fine. Henry built that barn strong enough to hold." Mara hoped she was right. The blizzard lasted 3 days. When it finally cleared, they dug their way out through snow that had drifted higher than the windows. The barn had held. The animals were cold and hungry, but alive. The chicken coop had partially collapsed under the weight of the snow, and they'd lost 2 hens to the cold, but the rest survived. They spent the next week digging out, repairing damage, and rationing food that was running lower than Mara had anticipated. She'd miscalculated how much they'd need, and now they were paying for it. "We can make it stretch until spring," Henry said, but his face told a different story. That night, Mara and Rowan lay in the loft, speaking in whispers so they wouldn't wake Sarah on the other side of the partition. "We're going to run out of food," Mara said. "I know. I should have bought more supplies. Should have planned better." Rowan pulled her closer. "You did the best you could with what you had. Nobody can plan for a winter like this." "That's not good enough. These people are depending on me." "Then we'll figure it out. Together." But figuring it out meant making hard choices. In January, Mara made the decision to sell one of the heifers. It broke her heart. She'd planned to breed the animal come spring, but they needed cash for food. Rowan rode into Dodge City with the heifer and came back with enough supplies to last them until March. "It's the right choice," he told Mara that night. "You're keeping everyone alive." "It doesn't feel right." Leadership rarely does. The word stayed with her. Leadership. Was that what she was doing? She'd never thought of it that way. She'd just been trying to survive, to build something that was hers. But somehow, without meaning to, she'd become responsible for other people's survival too. In February, a writer appeared during a brief thaw. He was young, maybe 17, with frostbitten fingers and desperation written all over his face. He'd heard about Mara's place from someone in Grafton. His family's farm had failed, and his father had started drinking, and his mother was too scared to leave. "I need work," the boy said. "I'll do anything. I just can't go back there." Mara looked at their dwindling supplies, at the barely adequate shelter, at the faces of the people already depending on her. She should say no. She should turn him away. "What's your name?" she asked. "Thomas." "Can you handle a horse, Thomas?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then you can stay, but you work for your keep, no exceptions." That night, Rowan pulled her aside. "We don't have enough food for 5 people, let alone 6. "I know." "Then why, Because I remember what it's like to have nowhere to go." Mara looked at him. "We'll manage, we always do." But managing was getting harder. By early March, they were down to beans and cornmeal and whatever game Henry could trap. Everyone was thinner. Sarah developed a cough that wouldn't go away. Thomas worked himself to exhaustion trying to prove his worth. Mara lay awake at night, listening to the wind and doing calculations in her head that never came out right. She'd taken on too much, tried to save too many people. Her land, her dream, was turning into a burden she couldn't carry. One morning, she walked out to the creek alone, needing space to think. The ice was starting to melt, revealing dark water beneath. Spring was coming. They just had to make it a little longer. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Rowan. "You're thinking about sending people away," he said. It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" "Because I know you, and I know that look on your face." He stood beside her, staring at the creek. "You're wondering if you made a mistake, if you took on more than you could handle." "Didn't I?" "No. You did something remarkable. You gave people hope when they had none. You built a place where they could be safe." "Safe and starving aren't the same thing, Rowan. So we find more food. We hunt, we fish, we make it work. And if we can't?" He turned to face her. "Then we tried. That's more than most people can say." Mara wanted to believe him, but belief didn't fill stomachs or keep people warm. That afternoon, another visitor arrived. But this one wasn't looking for refuge. Gideon Vale rode up to the cabin on a black horse, dressed in a heavy coat and looking like he'd never suffered a day of hardship in his life. Mara walked out to meet him, her hand resting on the rifle she now carried everywhere. "Mr. Vale," she said coldly, "you're not welcome here." "I'm not here to cause trouble." He dismounted and pulled a satchel from his saddlebag. "I'm here to settle a debt." "I don't owe you anything." "No, I owe you." He held out the satchel. "I've been thinking about what you said, about what I became. You were right, I went too far, and when you and Mercer nearly died in that fire trying to save livestock," he shook his head, "it reminded me that there are things more important than profit." Mara didn't take the satchel. "What's in it?" "Money. Enough to buy supplies and livestock and get you through the next year. Maybe two if you're careful." "Why would you do that?" Vale was quiet for a moment. "Because I destroyed a lot of people in this territory. I can't undo that. But maybe I can help build something instead." He set the satchel on the porch. No strings, no conditions, just considerate restitution. He mounted his horse and rode away without waiting for an answer. Mara stared at the satchel for a long time before she opened it. Inside was more money than she'd ever seen in one place, enough to change everything. Rowan came out and looked over her shoulder. "Well," he said, "that's unexpected. Do you think it's real? That he means it? Does it matter? Money spends the same either way." Mara closed the satchel. "I'm not taking his charity." "It's not charity. It's restitution. He said so himself." "It feels wrong." Rowan took the satchel from her hands and set it on the table inside. "You know what feels wrong? Watching people go hungry when you have the means to feed them. That's pride talking, Mara, not principle." She knew he was right, but accepting Vale's money felt like admitting she couldn't do it alone, like she needed to be saved. "I'm not ready," she said quietly. "You don't have to decide right now. Think about it." Rowan kissed her forehead. "But don't let stubbornness get in the way of doing what's right for the people counting on you." She thought about it for 3 days. 3 days of watching Sarah cough, and Thomas work himself sick, and Henry's hands shake from hunger he tried to hide. On the 4th day, she opened the satchel and counted out what they needed for supplies. Then she rode into Dodge City and bought food, enough to last them through spring and into summer. She bought medicine for Sarah's cough. She bought tools and seed for planting. She bought 2 more heifers to replace the one she'd sold. When she returned home, the relief on everyone's faces made her chest ache. "Where did you get the money?" Sarah asked. "Does it matter?" Mara started unloading supplies. "We have what we need now. That's enough." That night, alone with Rowan, she finally allowed herself to cry. Not because she'd failed, but because she'd learned that sometimes strength meant accepting help, and that was harder than she'd ever imagined. Spring arrived like a promise the land had been holding back all winter. The snow melted into rushing creeks, the brown grass turned green almost overnight, and the air smelled like mud and possibility. Mara stood in what would become her garden and pushed seeds into the soft earth with hands that were calloused and scarred and entirely her own. Sarah worked beside her, the cough finally gone, her face fuller now that they had proper food. Thomas was out with Henry repairing fence line. Rowan had taken the cattle to better grazing near the north boundary. The land hummed with activity, with life that Mara had helped create. "You think they'll grow?" Sarah asked, patting dirt over a row of bean seeds. "They'd better. We're counting on them." Sarah smiled. It was the first real smile Mara had seen from the girl since she'd arrived with that black eye and a story she still wouldn't tell. "I never thanked you properly for letting me stay. You work harder than anyone here. That's thanks enough." "It's more than that." Sarah sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. "Where I came from, women didn't get to choose. You just did what you were told and hoped it didn't kill you. Being here taught me something different." "What's that?" "That choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival." Mara looked at the girl, no, the young woman, and saw someone she recognized, someone who'd been told she was too much or not enough her entire life, someone who'd finally found a place where those lies didn't stick. "You're going to leave eventually, aren't you?" Mara said. Sarah looked surprised. "What makes you say that?" "Because you're learning, getting stronger, and eventually you'll be strong enough that you won't need this place anymore." "Is that what you want?" For me to leave? I want you to have choices, same as I wanted for myself. Mara pushed another seed into the ground. When you're ready to go, wherever you decide to go, you'll go with my blessing. And if you ever need to come back, there'll be a place for you here. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She wiped them away quickly and went back to planting, but her hands were shaking. That evening, Mara walked out to the creek where Rowan was washing up after a day with the cattle. The setting sun turned the water gold and painted long shadows across the prairie. "We need to talk," she said. Rowan looked up, water dripping from his hair. "That's never a good way to start a conversation." "This isn't bad. At least I don't think it is." She sat down on the bank. "People know about us. I figured they might. We're not exactly subtle." "Mrs. Brennan came by yesterday while you were out. She asked when the wedding was." Rowan went very still. "What did you tell her?" "I told her there wasn't going to be one." His face fell. "Yet," Mara added quickly, "I told her there wasn't going to be one yet." Rowan climbed out of the creek and sat beside her, not caring that he was dripping wet. "What changed?" "I did. Or maybe I just finally figured out what I actually wanted." She picked at the grass beside her boot. "I spent so long being afraid of marriage because I thought it meant giving up who I was. Becoming someone's property. But that's not what you're asking for, is it?" "No. I'm asking you to choose me the same way you chose this land, on your terms, in your time. And if my terms are that I keep my name and my land stays in my name, and people know this place belongs to both of us, but neither of us owns the other, then those are good terms." Mara turned to look at him. "You'd really be okay with that? With people knowing you married a woman who won't take your name? Who won't give you control of what she's built?" "Mara, I don't want control of what you've built. I want to build more of it with you." He took her hand. "And honestly, anyone who's got a problem with you keeping your name is someone whose opinion I don't care about anyway." She laughed, unexpected and genuine. "You're either the smartest man I've ever met or the most foolish." "Probably both." She leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the last of the daylight fade from the sky. "Ask me." "Now?" "Now." Rowan shifted so he was facing her properly. He didn't get down on one knee, didn't pull out a ring, just held both her hands and looked at her like she was the only real thing in the world. "Mara Holloway, will you marry me? Not because you need to, not because it makes practical sense, but because when I think about the rest of my life, I can't imagine spending it with anyone but you." She thought about the girl she'd been in that church in Grafton, trapped in a too small dress, surrounded by silent witnesses, being sold like cattle. She thought about walking out into the wilderness with nothing but rage and a torn dress. She thought about every hard choice, every bruise, every moment she'd wanted to quit, but hadn't. This was nothing like that church. This was the opposite of that church. "Yes," she said, "on my terms." "On your terms." She kissed him there beside the creek as the stars came out, and for the first time in her life, choosing someone else didn't feel like losing herself. They were married 6 weeks later beneath the cottonwood trees that grew along the creek. Not in a church, not in front of a congregation of silent faces, but in front of the people who'd actually stood beside them. Sarah and Thomas and Henry, Mrs. Brennan, who'd driven out from Grafton with supplies and a cake she'd baked herself, the young couple who'd bought Rowan's old ranch, a handful of other ranchers and farmers who'd heard what Mara had done and wanted to see the woman who'd stood up to Vale and built something from nothing. The ceremony itself was simple. A circuit preacher said some words. Mara and Rowan said some words back. They exchanged rings that Rowan had bought with money from the sale of his ranch, simple gold bands that caught the sunlight. When the preacher asked if anyone objected, there was only silence. Not the heavy, judgmental silence of that church in Grafton, but the peaceful silence of people who actually wanted to be there. "By the power vested in me," the preacher said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Rowan kissed her and everyone cheered. It was loud and chaotic and completely imperfect. It was exactly what Mara wanted. The celebration lasted into the evening. Mrs. Brennan's cake disappeared in minutes. Someone produced a fiddle and there was dancing, clumsy and joyful, in the space between the cabin and the barn. Mara danced with Rowan, with Henry, with Thomas, who stepped on her feet and apologized every other second. When Sarah asked if Mara was happy, she didn't have to think about the answer. "Yes," she said. "I really am." Later that night, After everyone had left or settled in for sleep, Mara and Rowan sat on their porch and looked out at the land they'd built together, the land that was hers by deed and theirs by choice. "You know this is just the beginning, right?" Rowan said. "Building a ranch is hard. Building a life is harder." "I know. There'll be droughts and debt and probably 100 things we haven't thought of yet." "I know that too." "And you're still okay with this?" Mara took his hand. "I'm more than okay. For the first time in my life, I'm not running from something. I'm running toward it." The summer that followed was hard work punctuated by small victories. The garden produced more than they'd hoped. 3 of the heifers calved successfully. Thomas proved to have a gift for training horses, and word spread. People started bringing him problem animals, paying in cash or goods or labor. Sarah stayed through harvest, but when October came, she told Mara she was leaving. "There's a teaching position in a town 2 counties over," she explained. "They need someone who can read and write and keep the children from burning the schoolhouse down." "You'll be good at that," Mara said. "You think so?" "I know so. You've got patience and you're stubborn as hell. That's half of teaching right there." Sarah hugged her tight. "I'll write to you." "You'd better." The girl, the woman, left on a bright October morning, riding the horse Mara had given her as a parting gift. Mara watched her go and felt proud rather than sad. Sarah had come to the ranch broken and scared. She was leaving whole and ready. That was worth more than her staying. In November, Mara's mother sent a letter. Her father had died. The funeral had been small. They were moving to Kansas City to live with Mara's aunt. Her mother wrote that she was sorry for everything, that she should have protected Mara better, that she hoped Mara could forgive her someday. Mara read the letter 3 times, trying to figure out what she felt. Grief seemed wrong. She'd grieved the loss of her father years ago when he'd tried to sell her. Relief seemed cruel. What she finally settled on was something more complicated, a kind of sad acceptance that some relationships break and stay broken, and that's okay. You can forgive people without letting them back into your life. You can move on without forgetting. She wrote back a short letter that said she was glad her mother was safe, that she hoped Kansas City treated her well, and that forgiveness was something they could both work toward. She didn't invite her mother to visit, didn't promise a relationship they'd never really had, just left the door open a crack in case someday they were both ready. It felt like enough. Winter came again, but this time they were ready. The cabin had been expanded over the summer with an addition that housed Sarah's old room plus space for storage. They had enough food to last until spring and then some. The cattle were healthy and well sheltered. When the first snow fell, Mara watched it from the porch and felt something close to peace. Rowan came out to join her, wrapping a blanket around both their shoulders. "Thinking about something?" he asked. "Everything. Nothing." She leaned against him. "Thinking about how different this is from last winter. How much has changed. You built something remarkable here. You know that?" "We built it." "No, you started it. You had the vision. I just helped hammer some nails." Mara turned to look at him. "That's not true, and you know it. Without you, I'd probably be dead in a ravine somewhere. Without you, I'd have lost my ranch and my future, so I guess we're even." They stood in comfortable silence, watching snow dust the prairie, until Rowan spoke again. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "About what comes next. What comes next is we survive winter and start planning for spring. I mean bigger than that. We've got this place running well. We've got help now with Thomas and Henry. What if we use that? Helped more people?" Mara frowned. "What do you mean? What if we set up a way for other women, other people, in bad situations to come here? Not permanently, just long enough to get their feet under them, teach them skills, help them save money, give them the same kind of chance you gave Sarah." The idea settled over Mara like the snow settling on the land, gentle but transformative. "That would take resources we don't have," she said carefully. "More land, more buildings, more everything. So we build it, slowly, one piece at a time." Rowan turned to face her fully. "You showed people something important when you walked out of that church and built this ranch. You showed them that you don't have to accept the life other people choose for you. But most people who need to see that can't. They're trapped, scared. They don't have your strength. I'm not that strong. You're stronger than you think. And if we could give other people even a fraction of what you've built here, just imagine what they could do with it." Mara thought about Sarah teaching children in a schoolhouse 2 counties over. She thought about Thomas, who'd arrived desperate and was now earning respect as a horse trainer. She thought about all the women in churches like the one in Grafton, standing at altars in 2 small dresses, being sold by fathers who saw them as livestock. It would be a lot of work, she said. We've never been afraid of that. And people would talk. They'd say I'm causing trouble, helping women run away from their families. Let them talk. You've never cared what people thought before. That was true. Mara had spent her whole life being talked about. At a certain point, you stopped hearing it. All right, she said, let's do it. But we do it right. We plan it properly. Make sure we can actually help people instead of just giving them false hope. Rowan grinned and kissed her. That's my wife. Over the next 2 years, Mara's ranch became something larger than she'd imagined. They built 2 more cabins with money from profitable cattle sales and donations from people who believed in what they were doing. They brought in 3 more women, each with their own story of escape and survival. A widow who'd lost everything to her late husband's debts. A girl barely 16 who'd run from an arranged marriage. A woman in her 40s who'd finally found the courage to leave a violent man. Each of them came broken in some way. Each of them left stronger. Mara taught them to read and manage finances. Rowan and Henry taught them ranching skills. Thomas taught them to ride and work with horses. They learned to repair fences and birth calves and stand up for themselves when someone tried to push them down. Some stayed for months. Others stayed for years. All of them left changed. Word spread, not just through Kansas, but beyond. Letters arrived from women asking if the stories were true, if there really was a place where they could learn to survive on their own. Mara answered every letter, even when she was exhausted, even when she wondered if she was taking on too much, because she remembered what it felt like to have nowhere to go, to stand in a church and realize you were alone, to walk into the wilderness knowing you might die there because it was better than the alternative. She remembered, and she couldn't turn away. Not everyone understood what they were doing. There were rumors. Some people said Mara was breaking up families, teaching women to abandon their duties. Others said she was running some kind of scheme, using desperate people for free labor. Mara ignored most of it. But when the criticism came from the church in Grafton, when Reverend Calhoun stood in his pulpit and condemned her work as ungodly rebellion, she rode into town to confront him. She found him in his office behind the church, surrounded by dusty books and the smell of old paper. "Miss Holloway," he said when she walked in, "or should I say Mrs. Mercer? You can call me Mara. We're past formalities." She didn't sit down even though he gestured to a chair. "I heard your sermon about me." "I didn't mention you by name." "You didn't have to. Everyone knew who you were talking about." She crossed her arms. "You called what I'm doing rebellion, said I was leading women astray. Aren't you? You're teaching them to abandon their families, to put their own desires above their duties. I'm teaching them to survive. There's a difference." "Is there? Because from where I stand, you're destroying the natural order of things. Women belong. If you say women belong in the home, I'm going to remind you that I was in your church the day you stood silent while I was being sold like cattle." Mara's voice was quiet but hard as iron. "You knew what was happening. Everyone knew, and not one of you said a word." Reverend Calhoun's face flushed. "That was different. How? How was it different?" He had no answer. Mara leaned forward, placing both hands on his desk. "I'm not destroying families, Reverend. I'm giving women who are already destroyed a chance to rebuild. If that threatens you, then maybe you should ask yourself why." She left before he could respond, but as she rode back to the ranch, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. She'd said what needed to be said. Whether anyone listened was up to them. When she got home, Rowan was waiting on the porch. "How'd it go?" he asked. "About as well as you'd expect. Did you punch him?" "I wanted to. Does that count?" "Close enough." He pulled her down to sit beside him. "I'm proud of you, for going there, for standing up." "I didn't do it for him. I did it for everyone we're trying to help, so they know we won't back down." "Even so, it took courage." Mara rested her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes I wonder if we're actually helping, if this is making any real difference. You saved Sarah. You saved Thomas. You saved 3 more women who would probably be dead or broken without this place." Rowan kissed the top of her head. "That's not nothing. That's everything." In the spring of their third year, something unexpected happened. Gideon Vale returned. He arrived on a sunny April morning, riding the same black horse, wearing the same expensive clothes. But something about him had changed. He looked older, tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. Mara met him in front of the main cabin, her hand instinctively moving toward the rifle that still leaned beside the door. "Mr. Vale," she said carefully, "I wasn't expecting you." "I know. I probably should have written first." He dismounted slowly, like his bones hurt. "I came to see what you've built, if that's all right." Mara studied him, looking for the trap. "Why?" "Because I'm trying to figure out how to do what you're doing. Help people instead of bleeding them dry." He looked around at the expanded buildings, at the garden where two of the women were working, at the corral where Thomas was gentling a young horse. "I've got money, Mara, more than I know what to do with, and I'm tired of it just sitting in a bank somewhere while people suffer. So give it away." "I want to, but I want to give it to something that actually works, something sustainable." He turned back to her. "You've built that. I want to learn how." They talked for 3 hours. Vale asked questions about how they funded the operation, how they found people who needed help, how they taught them skills that would actually sustain them after they left. Mara answered honestly, holding nothing back, because she realized that if Vale was serious, if he really wanted to help, then his resources could multiply what they were doing 10 times over. "I'm not asking for control," Vale said as he prepared to leave. "I don't want my name on anything. I just want to fund it, expand it, help you help more people." "Why?" Mara asked. "Really, why now?" Vale was quiet for a long moment. "Because I have a daughter. She's 11. And I look at her and I think about the world she's growing up in, the world I helped create, and I want her to have choices, the kind of choices you fought for." He met Mara's eyes. "I can't undo what I did, but maybe I can fund something better." They worked out the details over the following months. Vale provided money to buy more land, build more structures, hire more teachers. But true to his word, he stayed in the background. The ranch remained Mara's. The decisions remained hers. Within a year, they'd expanded to help 20 women at a time. Within 2 years, they'd established a network with similar operations in 3 other territories. Women who'd learned at Mara's ranch went out and started their own places, creating a web of safety and support that stretched across the frontier. It wasn't perfect. They lost funding sometimes. They made mistakes. Some women who came to them weren't ready to change, and watching them return to bad situations was heartbreaking. But more often, it worked. More often, women arrived scared and left strong. On a warm evening 5 years after that disastrous wedding day, Mara stood on her porch and looked out at everything she'd built. The ranch had grown into something that resembled a small settlement. Multiple buildings, gardens, livestock, people. Rowan came out and handed her a cup of coffee. "Thinking about that church again?" he asked. "How did you know? You get this look like you're seeing ghosts." Mara smiled. "Not ghosts, just remembering where I started." "You've come a long way." "We've come a long way." He put his arm around her shoulders. "Do you ever regret it, walking out that day?" "Never. Not once." She looked at him. "Do you ever regret coming after me?" "Best decision I ever made." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over land that had taught them both what it meant to be free. The sky turned orange and pink and purple, colors that belonged to no one and everyone. Somewhere behind them, women who'd come here broken were learning to be whole again, learning that they had choices, that their lives belonged to them, that choosing yourself wasn't selfish, it was survival. And Mara realized that all of this, was what she'd been fighting for in that church in Grafton. Not just the right to say no, but the right to build something better. The right to choose the life she wanted instead of the life others chose for her. She'd torn off that veil and walked into the wilderness with nothing but rage and a torn dress. And she'd built an empire. Not an empire of land or cattle or money. An empire of possibility. Of women who knew they could survive because she'd shown them how. That was worth more than any inheritance, worth more than any marriage bargain. Worth everything. "I love you," Rowan said quietly. "I love you too." And beneath the cottonwoods where they'd married, surrounded by the land they'd built together, Mara Holloway finally understood what freedom actually meant. It meant choosing yourself first. Not because you were selfish, not because you didn't need anyone, but because only after you chose yourself could you truly choose anything else. She'd walked out of that church refusing to bow, and she'd spent the rest of her life teaching other women to stand up straight. That was her legacy. That was her victory. That was enough.